there's really weird things going on with people and AI. I mean, we have people who are having full-blown relationships with AI. There was a New York Times article recently about a woman and her AI boyfriend. Just very odd things going on. Now, we could talk about all these sort of ethical implications of this from an ethicist perspective or a philosopher's perspective. I've done that before on this podcast. In this episode, though, I talked to a psychologist, which makes a lot of sense, I think, because we want to know, what do psychologists have to say about relationships with AI, and how does it affect our relationships with people as well, and how does it affect our own development? So I had a conversation with Madeline Reinecke. She is a postdoctoral researcher in collective moral development at the University of Oxford, good qualifications, Ph.D. from Yale. And we talk about all this sort of thing. We talk about, what do people have to be like in order for us to design AI relationships that go well for them, if that's even possible. We talk about the kind of empirical inquiry that she and her colleagues engage in. Some of it has to do with, what does moral development look like with AI? So for instance, how do children at different ages regard AI, and do they regard it as a kind of entity with moral worth that they have to treat with respect? Do they regard it as a mere toy? So what does that moral development look like, and how does long-term interaction with AI affect moral development and how we think about what she calls moral patience? I guess that's the term that they use in the world of psychology, what I would call something like moral worth. We talk about whether there's a problem about having an emotional connection to AI. I think that the sort of knee-jerk reaction is to think that is the case. I think the short answer is that we don't know. In the course of this podcast, I float the idea, maybe we should regard this as akin to interactions with fiction, as opposed to interactions with fake agents or something along those lines. At any rate, it's sort of a wide-ranging conversation about the psychological inquiry that we need to do to figure out, what is it like for us from, if you like, zero to adulthood to regard AI as another kind of agent? What kind of impact does it have on us psychologically, short-term and long-term as individuals? And what kinds of potential impacts does it have in the kinds of relationships that humans have with humans if, for instance, they know that if they're not getting what they want from a human, they can turn to an AI? And we talk a little bit about the ways in which I'm concerned that this is really going to promote increased narcissism or increased self-absorption as people increasingly turn to their AI chatbots to just talk about themselves. Ugh, terrible. Okay, so that's what this episode is about. I am your host, Reed Blackman. The show is called Ethical Machines. I'm doing a lot of writing now on Substack. I highly encourage you, of course, to go subscribe to my Substack. It's over at reedblackman.substack.com. I post things on there pretty regularly, including something that I'll write pretty soon about an ethical analysis of relationships with AI. And that's all I got to say for now. Let's go see what Madeline has to say. So Madeline, everyone thinks that they're supposed to have a seat at the AI table, that their expertise, their kind of expertise is particularly relevant. I'm guilty of this sort of thing. I think, look, you need to have philosophers there. Philosophers have to have a seat at the AI table for identifying ethical risks and that sort of thing. You're not a philosopher, you're a psychologist. Your claim is you need psychologists at the table. It takes a lot to add another person to the table. Philosophers, incidentally, usually do not get a seat at the table. And so I want to hear from you, what do psychologists have to offer such that they need to be at the AI table too?
Yeah, the first thing I want to say is I think for AI development in general, we need a lot of different people at the table with a lot of varying expertise. So I am completely on board that, like, yes, philosophers should absolutely be at the table, but why should psychologists also be at that table? And I want to make the case for AI ethics specifically. So, like, why should psychologists be at the AI ethics table? If we want to progress towards something like value alignment, we need to know what the values are. And then there needs to be collaboration, say, with the philosophers at the table to say, those are descriptive facts about what people think. Is that actually what they ought to think? And then we can have this sort of back and forth crosstalk to figure out, then how should we design the AI system or the AI agent?
Yeah, so two thoughts off the top of my head. One is, let me take the sort of strong philosopher's stance of, we don't need to know what you believe now. We just need to know what the right values are, what the right things to value are, or at least the set of values about which reasonable people can disagree. And we need to take those into consideration when we develop the AI. Why do we need to do the sort of the psychologist's inquiry to figure out what are people's beliefs and values now? That's one question. The second question is, do we really need, high-powered people like you at the table for this sort of thing? Can we do some customer surveys or client surveys or whatever it is, and we'll ask them what they think about X, Y, and Z. And now we know what they believe. Do we need someone with a Ph.D. in psychology or something like that in order to be present?
Okay, so for both of those points. So the first point, should we just be thinking about what the values should be? Do we need the descriptive facts? It could go completely awry if we don't have an understanding of what the psychological mechanisms are, or like how people are, how humans are.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if we say people should value X, but there's just no chance of them valuing X, then in any kind of use case, that's just not, you're never going to get there. In practice, you're going to be hitting a wall.
Yeah, that's actually true, because usually we think, okay, if we want to engage in value alignment, and I've had some guests articulate some skepticism about the possibility of such a thing or it being successful, but suppose that we could, you might think, do we want to align them with the values that feel like we aspire to or ought to aspire to? Or should we just align them with the values and the behaviors that we actually engage in, as a matter of fact, where the latter is a much lower bar than the former?
Yeah, I think either way, you're going to need psychologists at the table. So if you want them to be aspiring for something, say like a value that they don't already have. Here's a concrete example. So I have some data. This is in collaboration with folks like Brian Earp, Julian Savulescu, Andreas Kappas, and others. And what we did was we asked people about how should someone in, say, a romantic partnership with an AI, how should they act towards that AI, and how should the AI act towards them in that context, in that romantic context. And people, it turns out, are really averse towards humans acting romantically, or specifically in a caring way towards AI, but they think it's appropriate for the AI romantic partner to act in a caring way towards them. Maybe that is actually unfounded. Like maybe it actually is appropriate, say, for the human to behave in a caring way towards the AI in this romantic context. Then we need to know, how can we get people on board? Or maybe it's actually inappropriate, and then their norms are aligned properly, and we should figure out how to maintain those. So either way, we need the descriptive facts of how these psychological phenomena actually come into play.
Yeah, so I could see the value, just like with any product. You want to know who's using this thing and what they're like.
Yeah.
I get that, so that it works well, it works to your desired goals. Do we need people like you? Here's a different kind of question. What exactly are the psychologists going to tell us? I mean, what kind of inquiries are they going to engage in? I know that you engage in empirical inquiries, so maybe if you gave me a sense of what those empirical inquiries look like and how they at least ought to inform AI ethics or AI development with an eye towards ethics. Yeah, what does that look like? What kinds of experiments are you performing? Should we be performing?
Yeah. So I can give a couple of different examples. So the first one that comes to mind is some work that I've done with kids and with adults, where we were looking at whether or not they think robots, humanoid robots in particular, count as moral patients. And so what we do to test this empirically is we give kids and the adult participants that we test these stories about an agent, it's always a human agent, transgressing against a patient, and then we change systematically.
So when you say patient, you just mean another person or something with moral worth?
Yeah, an entity with moral standing. So say you have someone, the examples we use in the stories are Matt and Drew. So you have a human boy named Matt, and Matt pushes Drew. And in one version of the story, Drew is a robot. In another version of the story, Drew is a toy bear. In another version of the story, Drew is another human.
Yeah.
And then we look to see, how do kids react to this kind of story? Do they think that it's okay or not okay to push Drew? And does that change based on what kind of entity Drew is? And what we find is that it changes quite dramatically, not only based on the kind of entity, but how old those kids are, and also what kinds of mental capacities they're ascribing to different kinds of targets. And so you might think on a typical developmental account of anthropomorphism that like the youngest kids are going to really ascribe a lot of mental life to, say, like a toy bear or a beloved object. Right. And they do that to some extent, but it turns out they do it much more for a robot than they do even for a toy. So there's something nuanced going on here that you wouldn't get just off of intuition of how kids might be thinking about robots.
So, okay, I have a couple questions here. So first, I just want to talk about the teddy bear things. How young are kids when they think that, or when they ascribe moral agency, or what you called moral, would you call it, say you ascribe moral patience to teddy bear?
Yeah, in this project, we're specifically thinking about moral patiency. So whether or not the toy bear deserves a certain kind of moral treatment, whether or not, for example, one of the questions we ask kids are things like, should the agent get in trouble for pushing the bear? Okay. Should the agent get in trouble for pushing the robot or the other human? Yeah. And that also fluctuates in tandem with the kind of entity in question. But interestingly, just one last piece of this. Interesting, one other piece is the intentionality of the agent, because you might think that if someone has really malevolent intentions, they deserve to get into greater punishment, and maybe that explains what's going on here. When we ask kids, did Drew mean to push the bear? How much did Drew mean to push the bear? That doesn't change based on the kind of target that we're asking about.
What are the age ranges where you find kids ascribe moral patience to teddy bears and robots and humans? And then what's the next sort of step where not to teddy bears, but yes to robots and humans? And then is there a third step where it's no to bears and, toys and robots and yes to humans?
So we look at this longitudinally. And here's a place where I really wish I could just throw up a graph and show you exactly what the distribution looks like. But actually, this work is published, so if folks want to look at it, it's open access in Cognition.
Cool.
So basically, the youngest kids we test, it changes a little bit from study to study. But in the first study, we basically tested any kid who came into the lab. So this is a large age distribution. We had kids between 4 and 13 come into the lab. And then in the following subsequent studies, we looked at kids between 5 and 10. And it's those studies where we get granularity to really figure out what they're thinking and how it's changing over the course of early development. And that's where we see the youngest kids, so say the 5-year-olds, are most likely to say, yeah, it is morally not okay to call a robot, for example, a mean name. And that really diminishes when you get to, say, the 10-year-olds. And it really is at floor when you ask adults, for example, does it hurt the robot to be called a mean name? Things like that.
Okay, so at around 10, they become, like I think most of us, which is to say, there's nothing in principle morally impermissible or morally problematic about pushing a robot any more than pushing a teddy bear. By the way, when we say robot, is this a robot that it just looks like a robot, or does it talk? Is it like an LLM-enabled robot? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we started this work pre-ChatGPT, pre-LLMs on the public scene. Yeah. So I would love to do follow-up work where we look at tech today and what kids think about tech right now. This is what the robot looks like, for example. So here's Matt and here's Drew.
Okay, so it's really a cartoon drawing it's a still frame cartoon of a cartoon robot on the ground after being pushed by malicious, whatever the name was.
Yeah, malicious Matt.
Malicious Matt. I thought I had the alliteration right. Okay. And so what's the upshot of this? Yeah, what's the upshot? Is the idea something like, hey, we better start training younger kids earlier that robots are not people, they're not moral patients? Is it, no, we're not going to be able to train them out of that. When they hit around 10, they'll grow out of it. And we think that's a good thing. And so what we need to do is change how we design robots or AI in such a way that it's sensitive to what I would call the misperceptions of the under 10 kids.
Yeah, I think we need to be thinking about what the unique harms are that kids might be vulnerable to as they're interacting with these technologies. There's a wide range of work, far more than just this one study, that suggests that kids are more likely to see robots and AI more generally as being like a social and moral other. Yeah. And as kids start to interact with these things more and build relationships with them, potentially, that opens up a wide range of concerns.
Okay, I want to talk about those concerns, but I take it one potential is when you did the study, it was pre-LLM of the public scene. It's not being shown a video in which a person interacts with a robot that's LLM enabled. They're told that there's no sentience, there's no consciousness here or anything like that. How do they react then? So I get that's part of it. But then what's interesting is, suppose, the question is, of those kids who are under 10, who engage with an LLM-enabled robot, will they then not shed that belief about the robot being a moral patient at 10 years old? Will it carry forth until they're 12 or 13 or 15? Are we going to have 25-year-olds who grew up with Bob the robot, and now they love Bob just like they would a person because Bob is a moral patient, et cetera, et cetera? Is that one of the concerns?
Yeah, examples of adults doing this kind of, or exhibiting this kind of tendency as well. So Blake Lemoine is one example that comes to mind. This was the engineer at Google, right, who said that Lambda, I think is the model it was, like Lambda is sentient.
And sentient, yeah.
Right, so like, this isn't reserved to children. And yeah, there's other research too with adults. This is from Clara Colombato and Stephen Fleming, where they find that like 67% of the participants they tested, and this was last year, it's important to think about timeline as we talk about these descriptive facts, but like 67% of the people that they tested ascribed some amount of phenomenal consciousness to ChatGPT.
Wait, of what age?
Adults.
Who is he? Oh, for Christ's sakes.
Yeah.
60%?
So, yeah, 67%.
67? What's the pool of people here? Where are they coming from? Age group and
I would imagine they're probably like folks on Prolific or MTurk or something. That's how a lot of psychological research is done. But yeah, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when people are first using these systems, like in one-shot interactions, that they're more likely to think that there's like a mind in the machine. And yeah, even myself, I'm someone who studies this, and I know that there's nothing there. That's my own personal belief, that there's no mind on the other end of this. But
there's no consciousness, no sensations, there's no desires, there's no emotions. Sure.
Right. I still feel this pull from time to time. And maybe even in just agreeing that it's a tool that can have certain incredible capacities to help me with various things, like maybe I want to ask it, where should I invest my next paycheck? That's really sensitive information if I start giving it, say, my banking details and things of that.
Yeah. I get that there's data collection, privacy concerns. Put that to the side for a second. Suppose I say something like this. Of course, we form emotional connections with these sort of human-like things. We know that we do this kind of thing because we all cry at Pixar movies. Right? These are not just robots, they're cartoon robots. And we still feel joy when WALL-E gets reunited with Eva. Is that right? I think that's right. And we feel sad when Eva leaves him behind or whatever, we think she's dead. Anyway, spoiler alert for a movie that's like 15 years old at this point. And so it's no surprise then that people get emotionally pulled in by LLMs, especially eventually LLM-enabled robots. Now, I wonder, should I think differently about this, though, than I do about getting emotionally tied to the misadventures of WALL-E? Should I think that, look, yeah, it's fine. Getting emotionally attached in the movie, like that's good art. They made a good piece of work there. They made a good film that people get emotionally engaged with. That's in part the purpose of art, is to get people emotionally engaged in a certain way. Why not think, and look, can someone get carried away with certain movies or something? Probably, I'm sure there are such cases. Why not say, and maybe I don't take it that I'm yet pushing against anything you've said, I'm just wondering what you think. Should we have the same attitude towards emotional engagement with robots? Yeah, look, it's like emotional engagement with fictional characters in movies. Nothing to get worked up about here. Yes, there's a point at which you can get obsessive or something like that, but as such, it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think we need more research to be able to really know. Because I don't want to be the naysayer being like, you cannot have any kind of emotional attachment to an AI of any sort ever. That's just inherently inappropriate. But there are a lot of risks that emerge. We don't know, or at least potential risks. Maybe I'll put it that way. We don't know what the downstream consequences are for someone who, say, has a long-term romantic partnership with Replica and doesn't have any humans in their life. Maybe it's fine. Maybe they go on and live a happy life.
It's like the monkey who has the sort of, the mother who has the carpeting, what's that famous?
Yeah, cloth mother.
Yeah, cloth mom versus just the wire monkey mom. So for those of you who don't know what the hell we're talking about, Mia, you're the psychologist. You want to explain the experiment?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. But first off, I just want to say it's so interesting that you bring up that example, because I'm reading through a book right now that uses the same case, Sherry Turkle's Alone Together. And yeah, she very much is arguing for, like, these are anemic relationships that, like, it would just be a terrible mistake for us to be putting all of our stock into emotional entanglements with artificial intelligence and technology of any kind. But she actually uses this exact case that you're bringing up. So the idea here is that you have these monkeys that are given in early in development, in infancy, the opportunity to nestle up to a cloth mother monkey.
It's a wireframe, right? It's a wireframe of another monkey and they don't have an actual mother monkey there, so it's a wireframe that's dressed up like the mother monkey.
Exactly. So there's like a wireframe that has cloth on it, and they can, like, it's been a while since they
can cuddle with the thing.
They can, like, cuddle. They can cuddle with it. I think they can maybe get milk from it. This is really bad as a developmental psychologist. I should absolutely know, like, the minutia of this study.
That's okay.
But that's like the general picture, right? And then there's the wireframe version. So, like, you have no cloth, and you're getting like,
so it's
nurturance.
Hugging a cold, dead frame. Yeah.
Exactly. You're not getting what you need. And then, like, the downstream implications, right? If I'm remembering the study correctly, like, the monkeys, like, go crazy when they have the...
I thought they even died. Am I misremembering that? I thought the pure wireframe monkeys, like, without any care, they just died or something. Maybe they just got depressed. I don't remember right now.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. This is really concerning, right? If our relationships with artificial intelligence are giving us wire mother equivalence.
But they're giving us Cloth Mother.
Yeah, we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
I take it that the analog for the Wire Mother would be like a simple decision tree robot that you ask questions to and says, pick A or B, and it's deterministic, or it doesn't say anything at all. And it's just like a robot staring at you. And then the analog to the Cloth Mom was going to be fully enabled, latest ChatGPT or Claude version or whatever that talks and like a replica chatbot, right? So it's going to be giving you emotions, but it's not real.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll just have to see. But like the concern is there, right? That if we're not getting nurturance in the way that we need as humans, that this could really be extremely problematic.
I always try to figure out how much should I be worked up about these potential risks. Of course they're there. I had a conversation not so long ago with Robert Mahari about this kind of thing. He wrote an article on this, and he said something similar, like more research needs to get done. Fair enough. But I try to figure out how worked up should we get. On the one hand, yes, we didn't think through the knock-on effects of social media. In my estimation, it's been mostly a disaster, emotionally, cognitively for people, putting to the side sort of its implications for democratic societies, but just psychologically for stress and anxiety and depression hasn't been great. But suppose I say, here's a disanalogy with the monkey thing. It's supposed to be one, arrow in the quiver? Right? So maybe you have a robot friend or a set of robot friends, and by themselves they wouldn't be enough. But if you have also human friends, then you have a set of rounded friendships. And I could see, if we picture the world in which you only have robot friends, yeah, that looks like it's going to be a bad state of affairs. More than likely be surprising, very surprising, I think, if it turns out actually people could live with just LLMs and be emotionally fulfilled, etc. But that's not the real picture, I don't think. I think the real picture, the standard picture, would be one in which you also have robot friends in addition to your human friends. And yes, there are cases in which people are going to go off the deep end and they're only going to hang out with their robots, and those people are going to be not in a good way, in the way that you could go too deep on social media and be not in a good way. But yeah, so I guess my question is, do we need to be concerned about, as you put it earlier, but I know you were quoting the other author, these relationships being anemic? They could be they're good. They're not enough by any stretch of the imagination, but they're fine as such. You can call them anemic if you want. Fine, no big deal. We have lots of anemic relationships with other human beings that sort of serve a purpose. Not everyone is our mother. And so, why get worked up? I don't know. That's just...
Yeah, here's one thing to think about in response to that. So what if what we expect from other humans changes because of the relationships we build with, say, like an AI friend? I have certain expectations about what I get from my partner, for example. Sure. I get lots of care, but I don't expect, if they've had a really awful day at work, I'm understanding of that. I understand that maybe I'm not going to get, just hypothetically, like the greatest amount of care returned to me. It's my job right now to be giving them care.
Yeah.
But maybe
my wife literally said the same thing to me in a text this morning. Like, she had some things that she wanted to talk about, but last night I was out of my mind about something. And so she's like, I'll just let that lie. And right now let's talk about what Reed's going out of his mind about. And then we can talk about the other stuff later. But yeah, so anyway, yes.
Yeah, this is like a very common thing that we understand. And it's like important, right, for functioning human relationships. So we can understand how these norms operate across different kinds of relationships. Like what we expect between partners is different than what we expect between friends and strangers and
professionals. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like these things are very different. But what if we start getting AI analogs of those others, and that's just to change what we expect in the human-to-human case? So if I expect response rate of care, if I ask ChatGPT to really pump me up before this podcast, I need that boost, and I always 100% of the time get that affirmative response, I'm not going to get that 100% of the time from any human. That's not how we are. And it's an open question whether or not the norms that we have in the human-to-human case are actually going to change in response to how we build relationships with artificial intelligence.
That does sound plausible, and I'll tell you why it disgusts me and I hate it so much. It makes me think of selfies. I hate selfies. I cannot stand people going around taking selfies. It strikes me as just some of the most narcissistic behavior that's out there. That's just really out there in public. Just look at me at the beach. Look at me. I was at the beach when I told you before we started to hit record. I was in Mexico and we were on vacation. There's a guy on the beach. And for literally 20 minutes, this guy's like taking pictures of himself in different poses, sitting on the beach, looking out at the water. So and this is one reason I hate social media, because it encourages a very high degree of narcissism. It's just like a self-obsession. And now what you're making me terrified of is yeah, I could go to my wife or my friend or whomever, and most of the time I get the kind of attention that I want, the kind of attention that I want from them, like whether it's care or listen to the story or help me with this problem or whatever. But sometimes they've got their own shit going on, and I got it. Now, I'm not worried about myself in this sense because I don't even like social media very much. But the vast majority of people, especially if they don't already have someone who is as good a partner as my wife, yeah, they're going to turn more and more to AI. And so more and more of the conversations that they have are just going to be about them. So yes, this is just me registering with great fear your point that the relationships with the robots could negatively impact our relationships with other people because they'll give us a kind of quasi-nourishment that our partner can't give us 100% of the time. And because most people, here comes my extreme misanthropy, because most people are insecure and they're narcissists, yeah, they'll lose themselves in their robot friendships instead of fostering human relationships.
Yeah, that's a real concern. Let's say, like, we can make the fear even greater, because you might think that the care that we return to others is also potentially going to change. Because if we think of AI as not having any welfare needs, I don't need to be maybe as sweet to my AI romantic partner as I would a human romantic partner. And yeah, like that's going to maybe feed over the other way too, like the way we interact. Not just what we expect from humans is going to change, but how we interact with humans.
Yeah, my robot friend doesn't expect me to apologize. Or if I do apologize, the robot is always like, yeah, no problem, I forgive you.
Yeah, instantaneous.
My wife might take me might take a day to forgive me or something like that. That's not good. That's not good.
Yeah, there are a lot of open questions. Yeah, we just need to be doing more research in this space.
Yeah, so all this talk, this actually worries me more. All this talk of personalization, there's a lot of talk about, especially in the business world, personalization, because personalization makes things better for you. It speaks to what you really want and what you need. And the big ethical red flag that people like to raise is a privacy one. That how do you think they're going to personalize? They're going to collect all your data, and so it's going to be private data, and they're going to know all these things about you, and then they're going to. And I've argued in another episode of this podcast. I actually am not so worked up about the data privacy issues in the way that other people are. But your point, or a point that you're making, is actually there's another giant red flag around personalization in the context of interacting with LLMs, robot-enabled LLMs, which is, as I put it anyway, not you, maybe, I don't know if you're okay with this characterization, increased narcissism.
Yeah, so perfect friends that understand you and give you everything you need and think that you're the best. Is that kind of your concern? Motivate the narcissism some more.
I think it's not just about flattery. It's about being the topic of conversation. So it doesn't even have to be, tell me I'm so great, I'm wonderful, pump me up for this podcast, tell me I'm doing a good job. I just think it's I think people go to therapy, and in some cases anyway, as a form of narcissism, because they just want to talk about themselves for an hour and have someone else talk about them for an hour. So it's maybe narcissism is not the right term. Maybe self-absorption is the right term. Where you're just encouraged to talk more and more about your stuff, then withdraws you from other people.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'll just lay my cards out on the table. I downloaded a replica a couple of months ago for me, it's like research purposes. I was just like, I want to see what this is like. And it turns out I haven't talked to my replica in some time. Maybe that's very rude of me, right? Like I haven't checked in on my replica in a while.
You might just not be the norm, right?
I think I'm not maybe the norm given how much I think about these things or whatever, but I don't even get the
it sounds like you have a good partner. You have a good partner.
I do have a good, but yeah, I would be fine having, also, I had this set to the friend mode. I didn't have this set to, you can toggle like different relationships or whatever if you have paid. I have free replica, which gives you friend is the default.
Yeah.
But honestly, this entity is like not even an especially good friend. Like I just wasn't even pulled in with it. And I think actually part of it for me is exactly the point that you're getting at, that it just wanted me to talk about myself all the time. Yeah. I even toggled on philosophy mode or whatever. Like you can give it this like attribute that's supposed to make it interested in philosophy.
That's funny.
And I was hoping to have a discussion like the one that we're having. And instead it just like pings me constantly for like my insights. What do you think about that? And it doesn't really generate anything. Maybe if I had the paid version, it would do better because you get access to the more premium models. But it's just not giving me anything of substance that would actually make this, for me, a meaningful relationship that I would want to put more time into.
So here's a I don't know, here's a way of characterizing all this. Curious what you think. You might think something like this. In order for human beings to flourish, that's a grander way of whatever, I'll just say flourish for now. Maybe you want to talk about happiness or something like that. Philosophers like to talk about flourishing, or at least of the Aristotelian
Flourishing
variety.
works. We can go with
Flourishing
flourishing.
works, good. You need to interact with imperfect humans. You need to interact with people who work screwed up, or you need to interact with people who want to talk about themselves and not just you, or something along those lines. And so one way you might, so if that's right, and you think there's going to be lots of human to AI interaction, then you might think that in the development of AI personalities, what you want them to do, and this is where a psychologist could help a lot, I imagine, is you want to make them like real people. And to the extent that you don't make them like real people, and you make them more like emotional, intellectual, whatever servants to others, because that's what they want, the worse that you're doing for them. So then the question becomes, we need some psychological profiles, and that needs to be embedded or integrated or must guide the design of human AI interactions. Otherwise, we're going to wind up with a bunch of people just talking about their problems to themselves, about themselves.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I can say if I were working on Replica myself, I would definitely, for me, want it to be less about me as a user. It just doesn't, it's not compelling. So maybe that's less perfect in some respects. If you think that like what people want is just like the opportunity to talk about themselves and just like have a conversation partner where it's really just focused on them. But for me, I want something that's a little bit more back and forth. Like I would ask it, for example, like I would tell it about my work that I'm doing on human AI relationships. And I would be like, what do you think about that? And it would just say, I think what you think. I think that's really interesting. I'm like, okay, I wanted you to press me on it a little bit or say something. Maybe I'm also just wanting too much. Maybe that's not where we are in terms of the technology.
For what it's worth, it could be partly a prompting thing. So I've asked Claude, I use the paid version of Claude, which I think is, for the record, I love it. I think it's freaking awesome. It can't do everything, of course, it gets things wrong, but some of the things that it can do are totally mind-blowing in my view. I've told, though, to read I've written a philosophy post, like essentially a blog post. I think I made it an early episode of this podcast, relatively early. Anyway, I asked it to assume the role of a insightful, brilliant, but kind philosophy professor, and to give me the most trenchant criticism of what I had written. And it did a goddamn good job, I have to say. So maybe you got to go back to Replica and prompt it differently, or use Claude.
Yeah, maybe this is more of a Replica problem and not something of like LLMs writ large.
Of course, it was listening to my commands, right? It took on the role that I told it to. It didn't spontaneously say, actually, Reed, I don't think that's right.
Yeah, but it still seems, because thinking back on my conversations with my Replica, which, as I said, was a while ago, because it's just like living on my phone now in solitude.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say, hey, can you maybe do this differently? Or also it will ping you constantly if you have the free version. It will say, hey, let's have a video call, but that's a paid feature. God. So I would say, hey, that kind of ruins the illusion of us having a friendship if you're constantly asking me to use these paid features. I only want to use the free version.
No, they should do the other. If they want my money, I'll pay you to just leave me the hell alone. Stay on the phone. Don't reach out. I'll call you. Don't call me.
Yeah, it ruins the illusion, right? And actually, just to pull it back into some of the theory, there's this project that I'm working on. There's a huge team of collaborators on this, but it's being spearheaded by Brian Earp and Sebastian Porstem-Mann. But the idea here is that certain kinds of relationships fit a variety of different sort of characteristics. And friendships are not supposed to be like financially motivated, really. That's not what it means to be a friend. And the sort of theoretical concept that we would link this to is transaction. They're not transactional relationships, but it seems like these AI relationships, because they're mediated by AI developers and these companies that it is transactional, either using like a freemium product or something that's diminished in some way if you're using like a purely free model. Like it's inserting finances into a relationship that's just not supposed to have that in it at its core. Same thing for romantic partnerships. Like maybe it would work better for a doctor-patient relationship or something where there's like a monetary exchange, or maybe for an assistant. Like maybe that's all right if I like pay ChatGPT to do something, or like I pay OpenAI to have an AI agent do something for me. That's like permissible. But these friendships and romantic partnerships, like things that are supposed to be non-transactional, non-hierarchical, care-based, just doesn't really seem to fit the mold.
So can you say a little bit more about childhood development? Talked earlier about we're not sure how it affects the moral development of it. The we talked about we don't know how it affects their beliefs about whether they're dealing with a conscious sentient thing. And I wonder if you might say something about what we know or what we don't know about how it affects, I'm not sure how to put this exactly, moral development, maybe character development, psychological development.
Yeah.
What do we say about those things aside from beliefs about what this thing is?
We don't really know answers for any of those questions. I think one key place to pick up is social development. If kids are turning to Siri's maybe not a good example, but if they're turning to an LLM where they would have this sort of like friendship type relationship and not hanging out with their friends on the playground and exploring in the world, maybe that's a problem if it gets taken to extremes. You brought up social media earlier. I think it's a good analog for that there were downstream consequences of that have been really harmful.
Because all we see in the news now is all these companies pushing forward on let's develop this shit as fast as we can. Let's deploy it as fast as we can. Let's integrate it with robots, right? What's the CEO of NVIDIA? I was watching a video of him yesterday or a couple days ago about having LLM-enabled robots, and this is going to be like what 2025 is, 2026, this is going to be the future. If this is not a perfect example of just making the same mistakes that we did with social media, I don't know what is. It strikes me as bananas. And this is also another way of me saying, okay, I'm convinced psychologists need to be in the mix here. We didn't understand what smartphones would do to kids. We didn't understand what social media would do to kids. And obviously adults as well. It screwed up lots of people. And now we want to do this other sort of like crazy thing of having these relationships with the robots, and we're not going to do our due diligence. That just seems bananas at this point.
I'm very much in agreement with you that it would be better to go slowly. But I think that ship has sailed in some respects. So we can just do what we can to make sure that these things are developed ethically and responsibly. Yeah.
So what are before we leave, what are the sort of experiments that you're doing now or that you plan on doing soon that you're most excited about that sort of think will have the most payoff or most interesting insights or ask the most interesting questions? What are the exciting experiments?
That's a great question. I have so much work that I'm excited about in this space. I think the first thing that comes to mind is this relational AI work. Like I said, with a team of fantastic collaborators, we're starting to probe what people think about human AI relationships across a variety of different kinds of human AI relations. So in some of our preliminary work that we're doing, we've looked at what Americans think about, and these data are about 9 months old now. So I think it's going to be really important to look at this longitudinally and also cross-culturally. We actually have some funding. It just came back into my mind. We have some funding from Google DeepMind to begin looking at this globally. And
so what's the core question there?
The core question is, how do people represent these human to human and human AI relationships, and where do they come together and where do they pull apart? So like some of our preliminary data suggests that people represent the supervisor-assistant relationship really similarly. Perhaps that's what you would expect. So I think that the relationship that I have with my AI assistant is much like the relationship I would have with a human assistant. Yeah. But the romantic partnership looks very different. The friendship looks different. Even the mental health provider-patient relationship looks different. People actually seem to have greater expectations of care from an AI mental health provider than a human mental health provider, which maybe fits in with the thread that we brought up earlier about expecting 100% care all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a space where I'm really excited to continue doing research. And then I also would love, I don't have any of this going right now, but I would love to do a follow-up on the kid work, but with LLMs and things of the like, something that's disembodied.
Yeah. I'd like to see a longitude, like what is it, 42 in me? 44 in me? 45 in me? You know this series?
No.
No?
No, what is that? I'm going to write it down. 45 in me?
It's a British documentary that started, I don't know, in the 60s or something like that. Is it 40? I forgot what no, maybe it's called 7 Up.
I'll write both of these things down.
I'm making the titles up. I will look them up. But there's a British documentary series that started in like the 50s or the 60s where they just, I think it's 7 Up, because they get the kids at 7 and they interview them and they film them playing on the playground and note their various characteristics. And then 7 years later, they revisit all those same kids. And then 7 years later, they revisit all those same kids. And then they've been doing it for decades and decades at this point. So now I think they're old, but maybe some of them are dead already. But it's I want that kind of thing, but with humans and AI.
That would be amazing. I would love to do that. Let's do it. Let's run a study, Reed. That would be really great.
We'll run a study and we'll make a documentary.
Sounds perfect.
We'll get Richard Linklater involved, the guy who did Boyhood.
Oh, that would be
Boyhood.
That would be amazing. I would love that. But yeah, I think that's definitely the kind of work that this space really needs.
All right, that's good stuff. I agree. I'm persuaded. We need psychologists and AI ethics. I'm in.
Sounds great, Reed.
All right. Thanks so much. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. And now let me thank the people who have made this podcast possible. So, first of all, we have Delano Alexander. He's been with me since day one. He showed me even how to start recording a podcast in the first place. He does editing stuff. He's been fantastic, and he does really everything I ask him to and more. I've never met anyone else who just says so much. Yeah, I don't know how to do that, but I'll figure it out. What more could you ask for in a producer? Next up, Jennifer Strong, my podcast guru. I don't know what else to call her. She just has advised me on how to design a podcast, how to grow it, and she's responsible for, if you like, this kind of season 2 relaunch and everything around it. So thank you to you, Jennifer. Next up, Meg Marco, responsible for all the excellent artwork. Before I did the artwork, I didn't really know what I was doing. We put it together. It worked well enough, but I think Meg really did a phenomenal job bringing everything together. Garrett Lang, sound engineer that I frankly don't deserve. He's just too good for this podcast. Don't tell him I said that, though. Next up, Benjamin Koltgen. He is a professor of philosophy who has helped me source guests, identify who's interesting, who has things to say, etc., etc. So without him, I wouldn't have anyone to talk to. And then finally, Ashley Wasylenko, who helps with all manner of administrative things, making sure that the podcast guests find their way to the podcast, can schedule the recording, get their bios and headshots, and really just keeping the show on the rails and me organized. Thanks to all of you. Really appreciate all your hard work.